And we're going live in three, two. All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm joined here today by Brandon. Brandon Griggs. Welcome to my stream. And introduce yourself. Let us know who you are. Today we're going to be talking about technology.
Sure. Pleasure to be here. I know Sean from a class that I took where he was the master and I was the student, learned a lot. And we ended up kind of forging a relationship from that to explore some things in a deeper way. And that's been an awesome relationship. I'm essentially an entrepreneur. I always wanted to kind of explore the intersection of technology and art and science and business and religion and all these things. And I was extremely fortunate to exit a company and now spend most of my time thinking about these things. And Sean has been an awesome dialogue partner to kind of explore these further. So I'm eager to jump in and talk about some of these topics.
Very nice, very nice. Yes, we are talking about the course on the machine that was taught last year at Halcyon Guild. This is now turned into a book as well. That's available on Amazon.
Oh, great.
And yeah, exactly, precisely. The Machine: Reflections on the Realm of Technology. Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, and we get into various topics in that book. We speak of science, about ideology, about technology and its relationship to nature, about the system, and about myth. And these are roughly some of the topics we wanted to discuss today. And Brandon, yeah, you've been really getting deep into this whole topic of the relationship between science and technology. And you were talking earlier about how the technological aspect of science can be found philosophically in this sundering of subject and object, or the famous or infamous Cartesian split that I speak about in my book. Um, why is that particularly interesting for you?
Well, I think the way you kind of contextualize that in the book is quite interesting and points to some of the deeper truths here that we're kind of confronting is that this represents a fragmentation, a disintegration of the human totality, the totality of the human experience, of what human meaning and purpose kind of all include. And the way that I tend to phrase this is through a sundering of the human imagination, and that technology is something that comes from the human imagination. And so I kind of use that as a means of neutralizing this kind of like need to demonize technology, or to put it into what I would consider false binaries of technology and art, these types of things. Others might not want to go that far with me in the way that you phrase technology in this book. You may not be as willing to go that far to me, but I see technology as one of the human imagination's greatest achievements. And
Mm-hmm.
I think due to the nature of technology, it's able to compound quantitatively over time in ways that we've struggled to compound things like philosophical wisdom, political wisdom, art, culture, these types of things. So our technology has kind of uh, exponentially taken off, and almost detached completely from these other aspects of human imagination. And I think that plays nicely with this notion of a sundering of subject and object. And so that was obviously a thread that you were playing with in the book. And you kind of ground it as well in this larger notion of a mythical context.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of contextualize this as this archaic period where there was a unity of subject and object, and offering this notion that whatever our response to technology is going to be or must be, um, a necessary requirement that will be mythological, and a component of that mythological response will be this uniting of the subject and object. Is that a correct read of kind of how you view this and how you outlined it in your book?
Yes, yeah. Well, I think it's relevant here to look at where this kind of Cartesian split comes from, and Though I wouldn't be an expert or agree with everything that Auguste Comte says, but he made up kind of a genealogy of philosophy that has kind of transitioned from myth to metaphysics. That metaphysics kind of has been myth metabolized in a certain sense through a certain kind of study. And so it's not unreasonable to say that the Cartesian way of viewing the world is inherited from a kind of myth, a myth in which originally the lines were more blurred, you could say, but you could see them already kind of peeling off in descriptions of alchemy, for example, of medieval alchemy, where you have matter with spiritual properties and spirits with material properties, but them kind of splitting but morphing and morphing into one another and influencing one another as the lines were still blurred. But once you come to this fully, you could say, metabolized, fully developed stage of metaphysics, then there is a kind of a need to logically separate, distinguish, and then work with rigid definitions in order to engage in a kind of rigid philosophy or rigorous philosophy, rather. And I think that's what Descartes kind of did when he split the world into two worlds, essentially. When he made these two worlds, the res cogitans and the res extensia, the world of extended bodies and the world of cognized entities, and then their mediation in, on the one hand, the pure subject, but also on the other hand, God, right? And so you still have a lot of, you could say, inherited mythical aspects such as God, but them being turned into like a pure abstract metaphysical concept. And here we find basically this closure where the extended bodies are in its own world, in their own closed off world, and their relationship to one another is defined by pure natural science, by something that Kant would later coin as pure natural science, being mathematics, theoretical physics, the, let's say, the fundamental laws, mechanistic laws of material nature. And you can already see here in all clarity a sectioning off of the subject, a sectioning off of thought, of what the mind can perceive from the material realm of mechanized causality. And so I would say, or I argue, that this is essentially the breeding ground of technology. It is the fertile ground on which technology could grow and develop, allowing for a rigorous investigation of the material world, with the precondition of locking out any kind of distortion and influence a subjective observer would have. And as you said, I would argue that a lot of the obstacles we're facing now in progressing with various sciences are met because of the reason that we have locked that subject out, and that we are actually engaging in a kind of myth that no longer is fit to engage with the needs of further developing our understanding of the world.
So this sectioning off of the subject, you qualify this as the breeding ground of technology. I guess I would ask, is it the breeding ground of technology or the breeding ground of science? Where do you see kind of the relationship between the two? Clearly, technology existed before this Cartesian split, and in ways that many thinkers have kind of wanted to distinguish between, pre-modern and modern technology. So where does this notion of the subjective objective divide kind of play into technology? Because I think it's clear in science, right? And I think we could draw out that story, but I think it gets a little murkier with technology. And so, how do you think about those two in relation to this subject object divide?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I would, to a certain degree, agree with Heidegger's characterization of modern techniques as something other, as the Gestell. I would, to make it a bit clear and free from like new terminology, German terminology, I would say there's
Yes.
a distinction of looking at technology as a kind of, um, you know, companion of humans or tools that humans use. There's a distinction between that and looking at technology as kind of a historical event that we are living through today, and that characterizes our age today and also kind of reframes everything that had come before. I would say that even up until 500 years ago, people would have understood the relevance of technology, but it wouldn't have been such a core aspect of their age as opposed to other ages that came before them as it is today. And I think that warrants a kind of carefulness in the investigation analysis of technology that we speak of today. And but at the same time, obviously we can't we need to remember that, like, everything builds on what came before. So it's also not something like a kind of clear objective on off button that was switched on with Descartes. There's a reason Descartes came up with these ideas that had to do with what was there before, of course. So what I'd say is, as Heidegger said, that like even though modern technology came afterwards, the rise of modern science was technological in its nature. There is something about modern science in this Cartesian way that is already inherently technical or technological in respect to our technology we see today. Something that was not necessarily the case to that same extent beforehand. And that difference, I think, is kind of running parallel with this rise of modern science. It's impossible to disentangle them because one wouldn't be possible without the other, and vice versa.
Right. I think to rephrase that in mythological terms, there's a unifying force that's underlying both of those trajectories. Right. I think that's one of the more interesting things that I got out of Heidegger and the question concerning technology, is that to kind of rephrase what you just said, although modern science precedes modern technology chronologically, the point that he makes is that there is a spirit embedded in modern technology, and that spirit is what also precedes modern science. It's what makes both of them possible.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. And obviously, I mean, I have also read very interesting authors like Lewis Mumford that, make the radical case of it being, not a modern phenomenon at all, like whatsoever. That like the mega machine was already there with the ancient Egyptians and in many ways more sophisticated than what came afterwards. And that like each technology can kind of find a predecessor that kind of laid the groundwork for it. So people like to focus on the steam machine, right? Like to focus on the steam machine when speaking about our technological age. But I mean, how many steam machines are in operation right now? You could say our age is more determined by electricity or the computer or internet or whatever. Or you can go back before the steam machine. What about the clock? I mean, you can't really neglect the clock, the invention of having a sort of measurement, a precise measurement of time that can be synchronized, and what effect that has on like society and the structuring of the day and all these kind of things. And you'll always find something before that, and it's kind of like an exponential curve. If you zoom into it, it'll just look like an exponential curve again, And so to a certain degree, it becomes arbitrary where you put the cutoff point. But I see it as relevant when looking at philosophy, specifically at philosophy of science, to locate that cutoff point where it's oftentimes, conventionally located, and that is at Descartes, at Galilei, at these figures that kind of broke from a, you could say, scholastic, theological framework of understanding nature.
Where would you put Bacon in that lineage?
Wasn't Bacon, or am I completely off? Wasn't Bacon around the time of Galilei as well?
Yes, but he's kind of he's primarily known for putting some of the kind of philosophical underpinnings. I mean, he did a ton of experimentation, um, but he was also known for kind of setting up, this notion of a new organon, a new kind of like experimental method of trying to understand nature, depend it to our will, and kind of also playing off Machiavelli in terms of that we're no longer willing to be subjects to sheer fate, and that part of this notion of human progress is the ability and the control and our capacity to remove ourselves from the whims of fate of nature. And so like I'm always a little hesitant. I think, and I'm not suggesting you're doing this at all, but like Descartes almost, it's phrased as this original sin almost of this kind of like materialistic and reductionist bent.
Right.
Um, and I think it is useful to like he needs to be mentioned as a starting point. But I think like to your point of how it can keep going back,
Yeah.
uh, there's a long and storied lineage here that even goes back certainly into the Greeks and further.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what you mentioned with Mumford and his idea of the mega machine and going all the way back. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, when you look at, say, ancient Egypt and their construction of the pyramids and kind of the machine-like caliber that it took to construct those, is, I mean, one of the differences between that application of technology and today is you could argue that there was a greater unification between subject and object, and that it was clearly in service of mythical uh, type endeavors, right? Like these weren't just pure utilitarian kind of standing reserve type, Heideggerian applications of technology. These were in service of the deification of the pharaoh, that entire mythology that underpinned that. Uh, there's a real sense of the myth and the technological kind of merging there to create things that, quite frankly, as a civilization, we are no longer capable of creating. Like we're just no longer capable of creating something like the pyramids or the Great Wall of China, these types of things that like we see still persevering in our modern world. These are engineering efforts that can no longer be duplicated, not because of technical skill, although some people might argue that that's also true, but just sheer force of will, right? The non-technical, the non-utilitarian reasoning, motivational force that would be required, or even some could say in Egypt, the slave economy, like that would be required to kind of build that. So like, how do you think of that period of technology in terms of myth, in terms of the subject-object divide?
Yeah. Let me first address the first point you made. I wasn't. I want to clarify. I wasn't really trying to pinpoint anything on a specific person like Descartes
Right.
or Galilei. I would say it's. I would say it's a lot of people. There's always this dialectic between individual pioneers and the societal conditions that enabled them in the first place. It's probably a lot of discoveries that some of these men made that wouldn't have been possible at an earlier time or at a different place in the world. So obviously, yeah, you can include Bacon, you can include Newton or Copernicus or many others. In this, it's you can see it more as like an attempt at finding a genealogy of thought, finding a genealogy of what kind of Western thought amounted to. And with the machine, with the mega machine of ancient Egypt, another aspect as well is that the majority of components was made up, so to say, the components of the machine, the majority of them was made up of humans, right? Like the parts of that machine were mainly people, were mainly people and their strength and their limbs and their brains. Whereas the machine we're speaking of today is kind of characterized by this, you could say, almost uncanny automation, this uncanny kind of uh, um, simulation of a human faculty through purely mechanistic processes, starting off with the steam machine, but I'd say probably with the clock and then the steam machine, and you know, especially with computers and now AI and all these things, just seeming like an ever more intense, uncanny replication of human faculties, right? And so I would say it is, of course, a non-trivial difference that you had humans being the parts of the mega machine in antiquity, because that required a different kind of, you could say, setup or structure to have all of these humans engage in concert like that, engage in unison like that. It's in a certain sense, even though it's hasn't been achieved by humans very much, in a certain sense it's easier to get a lot of metal or metal components or silicon components to work in unison than to get a huge group of people to work in unison, and well coordinated and well ordered, uh, kind of how would you call it, cooperation. And for that, as you correctly address, there needs to be something powerful uniting them, something powerful uniting them that transcends them individually, something that makes it worth dedicating a whole chunk of your life to working on that, to being part of that machine. And that really does exemplify the power that the myths of the time would have had, compared to the kind of myths we have now. The myths we have now are, in a sense, those that have locked us out from the world of mechanistic cause and effect. In one hand, it has locked. It's kind of both extremes. It's in a sense contradictory. In the one hand, it has locked us out. We see consciousness and the subjective observer as something radically different from how we want to investigate and study the world, the natural world. And at the same time, we understand ourselves and our brains as being so bound to material processes and material cause and effect structures, that it's hard for us to find any middle ground between the kind of free subject and the sovereign individual, and at the same time the complete, like, massively entangled slave to all of the contingent influences on us.
I think one of the things you just mentioned there is insightful in kind of contrasting myths, because you said, in a sense, it's easier to kind of align machines, to coordinate machines, to put them in service of large projects that require such levels of effort and coordination. I would push back on that, because I think like the very evidence of the pyramid says that's wrong. I think like, to create something like that today, what we're basically admitting is that like clearly its historical evidence points to the fact that such levels of coordination are possible. And I think then you have to start to draw the thread on, well, what is lacking today that makes us think in that technology that the machine is happy to reinforce that the human collective is no longer capable of such efforts of coordination, right? And that's very much a myth of the machine. The technology, the machine wants us to think that there is a hard ceiling on human coordination, right? On the collective capacity to do things bigger than ourselves, to transcend the tribe, to put Moloch in its place, like all of these kind of different ways that we contextualize this. But this is all very much like this notion that, oh, we can avoid politics. Politics is messy and hard, and we'd rather have the objective bias of data information kind of make these decisions for us, because that's easy. The more that we can kind of delegate to the algorithm, the less that we have to confront our own particularity, the less that we have to do the hard work of community building, of politics, of these types of things. And I think like where this comes back to myth is this notion of what if it's this entire idea of myth itself that is the key to unlocking higher levels of coordination. And what is kind of the difference between our modern world is that we no longer have these myths that are capable of uniting anything beyond the tribe, beyond nationalism, beyond these kind of current hard limits on what we perceive as the restraints of human coordination. And so, like, again, I think the historical evidence proves that this is quite possible, and has done things that we are no longer capable of doing. It's not because they have better technology; it's because they have better coordination. Why did they have better coordination? Because it was unified around myths strong enough to coordinate. And you could say, like, sure, like some of this is slavery, but that can't be all of it, right? And there's other examples beyond the pyramids and slave economies and this type of thing.
Yeah, you touched on something important there. About speaking about politics and how it's messy, and that's also something I address in the second chapter on ideology in my book.
Yes, this book.
Precisely that book. um, Namely, like the awareness of how the grand myths had been, in a sense, swept away by the technological and the scientific revolution. There was, I think, a real sense of how the world has kind of gotten lonely. The gods are gone, and we are kind of alone on this distant tiny rock hurling through space. The world had kind of gotten lonely and nihilistic, where kind of the majority of everything is just nothingness. It's just a void. And that pertains to both like the physical world being mostly empty, but also the world of meaning being mostly empty. And I think things like Marxism, I would say, were real attempts, or I real kind of projects that would want to bring back what you're speaking about, that would want to bring back a kind of collective coordination, bring back collective coordination in the age of the modern machine. It was kind of trying to radically address this alienation that has happened through science and technology, and kind of bring back a heroic subject that would take control collectively of these technologies to build a kind of utopia, to build a new world, a new reality. I think there was something truly mythical and kind of cutting edge, you could say, about that. And in many ways, that idea has kind of run its course and come to a halt. And you can argue about whether it was successful or to what extent it was successful, because it did lead to a lot of changes in culture. It did lead to a lot of revolutions and renegotiations about how to run society. A lot of rediscoveries of new principles um, of doing away with, let's say, traditional norms and things like that. A lot of the ideals of the socialists or communists have been a success somewhat, but the particular utopia and the overthrow of the fundamental overthrow of the mode of production, none of that has taken place, and it with each year it's kind of seems less likely. With each year it seems like this vanguard is kind of in its last breaths, and running on fumes, so to say. And so I think what we're dealing with is kind of not only a lack of this powerful uniting myth in the age of the machine, but a lack of that powerful unifying myth um, after an attempt of finding it has already failed. Right?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I kind of phrase this is communism, for whatever flaws that you might want to ascribe to it, it had some notion of the good, right? And any notion of the good is something that I think the machine, right, Technics, is going to find threatening. And and I think Borgman does this really well in kind of like equating liberalism uh, with technology and kind of like how they really fit each other, because the liberal project is not interested in declaring a good. All it's interested in is kind of giving us tools by which we can pursue our own individual goods. But it wants to draw the line on what the good actually is. It's the pursuit of these things that it wants to enable.
But does it have
And
an evil?
does it have an evil?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Well, you just said what did you just say doesn't have a good?
It doesn't have a notion of the good.
And that's
It's
what
not interested.
specifically the technological worldview or modern liberalism?
Well, both. Like that's why they are aligned in a way that kind of led to their material dominance in the face of communism, right? Like relative to communism, like you could almost argue that there is an inherent conflict between um, this notion of the machine, right? And maybe we should define that and kind of how you phrase that. Um, there's a conflict there between this kind of goal-oriented notion of the good that communism is pursuing, uh, that is going to be something bigger than technology, something capable of guiding it and judging it. Like you can even see that to some degrees with China today, and that China is perfectly both willing and capable of saying, uh, "No, children, you do not get to play video games in unlimited fashion. These are the times where you get to play them, and you only get to play this amount, right? And because there is a greater good than the freedom of playing video games, and we are going to remodel society uh, in efforts to kind of pursue that good. And obviously, like a liberal democracy would never allow that unless there was some kind of like overwhelming majority that kind of demanded it, right? And so, in a sense, here there's this notion that like if we get to the point where um, technology demands this kind of like notion of a good that's capable of guiding it, judging it, evaluating it, correcting it, is a liberal democracy capable of doing that? One that is kind of like fundamentally also opposed to this notion of an overarching good. It's yes, we can all pursue it, but ultimately we're more interested in a plurality of goods, and these interesting ideas of negative and positive freedoms and everything that's kind of baked into the liberal project. This is amazing for bottom-up innovation, right? Particularly when combined with the capitalist market. Like everything that we've seen in our technological world has emerged from exactly that synthesis. But when we get to the point of kind of now it's taken on this mythical quality and something of an equal caliber is necessary as a course corrective, as some kind of something big enough to kind of guide it and judge it. Uh, is that even possible anymore? Right. So I think like that's an interesting aspect of communism that kind of like gets overlooked in just like a pure dismissal of it based on its kind of material historical failures.
Yeah. Let me push back a little bit on this notion that like the technological liberalism has no good and evil. It, I would say any kind of ideology requires a form of self-preservation, and so I would say today's liberalism does identify its enemies as being those who oppose liberalism, right? Those who oppose a kind of globalized, open society, and these kinds of things. Um, what I find interesting though is can these two goals kind of separate at some point? Can the ideological underpinning of technology separate from the ideological underpinning of liberalism? And I would suspect yes. I could imagine there being a kind of technological system with quarantined culture zones, right? In a sense where, like, for example, as China being the model, them having their own internet,
Mhm.
them having their own kind of version of everything that we were, everything that we think of when we think of the internet, they have their own version of, and whether the future will be just a multiplicity of technological bubbles of cultural quarantine zones, so to say, and whether, in a certain sense, technology can then develop its direction or its new direction in that form, and finds its own kind of its new pathway to develop that way, but actually then divorced from modern liberalism as we know it.
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting, right? Because on one hand, you have this, I think what many people perceive as this dangerous momentum towards global homogenization, right? And how much kind of our interconnected world is leading to that. And so essentially, how much we're removing our capacity to be particular, how much we're removing our capacity to have uh, isolated areas by which independent evolution is possible, right? And China does represent that. But on the other hand, you could also argue that this separate internet, this quarantine is completely parasitic on the innovation that happened in the West, right? Like none of it was kind of ground up from China. It's just like, oh, let's just catch up. And this is a lot of what the economists point to when in the economic regression of third world to first world, just like this catch up principle. And what lessons can we learn from that when it's just merely catching up to things that, whether it's management techniques or best practices or just simple technological and industrialization. So I think a similar argument, like some people will look at the Amish as this kind of interesting kind of quarantine, right? Where they very much have a sense of the good, and that very much defines their relationship to technology. Most people think that the Amish are just strictly anti-technological for religious reasons. They're not. They're very anti-technology, kind of infringing upon or compromising or impeding what their larger goals are as a community and as a religious practice. So they're very deliberate in terms of how they accommodate technology in ways that many people who look at the West and how little kind of thought or planning or circumspection is going around something like the pursuit of AI. They look to the Amish and be like, like here's a model of something that we can do. But they fail to account for the fact that the Amish are completely parasitic on this larger community and this larger society of innovation. So I think like there's, we can problematize that and kind of get closer to what perhaps is required here. Because I think it's pointing in both directions.
Well, I mean, the question is whether with increasing quarantining, whether it needs to remain parasitic. I guess to rephrase what you said. I mean, one obviously, in a certain sense, this kind of quarantining could be compared to a form of fragmentation, maybe a second Dark Age, Middle Age kind of thing, where you had the Roman Empire and it fragmented, disintegrated, and then you also had a regress of technology. But then it was kind of then the precursor to the new form of technology that arose after that to come about, and so the question is obviously if how these are tied to one another, how the kind of cultural or mythical aspect of a society is tied to its technological development, or whether technology is just some sort of objectively structured setup that just whatever culture is advanced enough will discover and will have built up in almost the exact same way, just with slight design differences, right? But I would say that, like, I can imagine a kind of regress happening initially when it comes to like fragmentation and various quarantine zones, but then a kind of change of trajectory, or a splitting up into multiple trajectories, if one can assume something like a multinaturalism, not just multiculturalism, like a multifaceted perspective on nature leading to a multifaceted development of technology. But that's obviously kind of pure speculation at that point.
I mean, my question would be, for these different quarantines, what are the myths that are driving them to innovate? right? So I think like China clearly has this myth that is driving this. And I think like the only myth capable of something like liberalism is exactly what you described in terms of this self-persistence. Because if we look at the history of innovation in the West, the exceptions to the rule of kind of bottom-up market-driven innovation are these grand government-led projects in the face of threats to self-persistence. So of course, you're thinking of the Manhattan Project and the Apollo program. And even to some degrees, the internet was the result of
Mm.
wanting to assure that critical infrastructure could withstand nuclear threats and there was no single points of failure.
You
And
could
so,
almost count the entire New Deal as something like that.
yeah, to a large degree, um, that well, I tried to think about it. We don't have we don't have to get into it.
Yeah.
But anyway, right? Like these were strong myths that were capable of driving this level of innovation. That then, everything else, all these other quarantines have essentially been parasitic upon. Um,
Mm.
Certainly for the 20th century, and much of the 21st as well. So like that would be my question, right? Like, and that gets into this interesting thread that you mentioned in terms of how inevitable are some of these progressions. Like if it wasn't Galileo and Descartes and Bacon, it would have been other people, right? Like this sundering of subject and object, it had to happen for much larger reasons than say the Enlightenment project or just these other kind of like historical forces. And I think like that's the question today as well, is like, yes, would we have had nuclear weapons at some point? Would we have the internet at some point? Yes, no, maybe. But it's not just a matter of these things coming into existence. I think how they come into existence uh, plays a huge role into the kind of ultimate adoption into society, into how they actually manifest um, at both the macro scale and the micro scale. And so I think that's, again, it's an interesting question that has many sides to it. That it's at least difficult for me to just fall on one or the other.
This actually ties in very well with another famous myth, and that's this kind of idea of Atlantis having been a global civilization that collapsed at some point, that had
Mhm.
high technologies and things like that. And it's kind of ties into this idea that like the global civilization is kind of the peak, it's the summit, and after that it just falls apart. And like we can't imagine something bigger or something else having been there before. I mean, it's either that or that didn't exist either and was just hunter gatherers and nothing else before that, right? Um, and yeah, I think what is so characteristic of technology in our age, as I described it earlier, as a technology as a historical event, so to say, is that it arose together with a globalization, with a kind of uh, um, mobilization of resources across the whole planet. Um, First, beginning in you could say the first round of industrialization with a kind of British dominated global trade network, and then transitioning into, you could say, the nuclear age, or the digitized age that is more led by the United States, and it's no longer focused on the oceans, but also on aerospace and satellite technology and all these kind of things. And so if one wants to make a kind of a pinpoint a major distinction, is this kind of global mobilization of resources, that the only thing we can think of that came close to that was the Roman Empire. And you can even see in like um in terms of the size of the cities, I think London was the first city to crack 1 million inhabitants since the fall of Rome, right? um
Maybe in uh, your Eurocentric view of history,
oh yeah,
but
you
I
reckon
mean,
maybe in India or China there's
no, my friend, Mesoamerica and South America.
oh
You forget, in the age of exploration, the
okay.
Europeans were dumbfounded by the sheer majesty of the cities that they saw.
But did they crack a
In
million
the New World.
inhabitants?
It's they don't know for sure.
Okay.
It's hard to say, and especially with like the Aztec civilization, they had this kind of interesting geography of the floating cities with the canals and such in this kind of bowl between two valleys. but their kind of empire, so to speak, reigned far beyond that in terms of many kind of subjective tribes and sub-tribes, and there's a ton of interesting tangents to get into there. But anyway,
Okay, okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, you could say that the Roman Empire, in a sense, was a kind of a prototype of the global system we can see today. As in, instead of the world oceans, it was focused around the Mediterranean, and you could see maybe the Mediterranean, if you stick with that analogy, as a kind of a smaller test ocean to like the world oceans that were then dominated by various colonial powers and ultimately by Britain. Um, but yeah, I yeah. So that to get to your
so what's
point,
the?
sorry.
I was gonna say, so wait, what's the myth here exactly? The myth, like, recap the myth for me here, because
Well,
I'm.
the myth in a sense would be then like liberalism helps technology to the extent that liberalism tries to maintain an increasing globalization, to maintain an increasing integration of global economies into a globalized network that follows the same kind of mythical principles, which I would say is always opposes a kind of isolationist attitude that they would refer to as fascism or Nazism or whatever. It's evil. Its ultimate evil, I would say, is a kind of what liberalism would see as a regress into archaic isolationism, archaic reactionary um, closing off to that globalized system. So in that sense, that's where I would see the collaboration between the technological system and the myths that power liberalism today. And yeah, I can see here how, just like a breakup or fragmentation in Rome led to regress of the technological level. It could lead to the same with a fragmentation or quarantining here. But the question is there any way to prevent that, or is it even desirable to prevent that? In a certain sense, it seems like certain ideologies at some point no longer are capable to carry their weight. And are we going to observe that with liberalism?
So close the loop here on this notion of kind of return to the archaic as a potential um, signpost, guidebook to kind of thinking about uh, a mythical response to technology, because I think for a lot of people that would seem confusing. In that, how does it account? How can something that is essentially pre-technological uh, overcome, respond to, have something to offer that can uh, neutralize, convert? Like, what would be the goal, and how would it be able to do it? Like, how do you think? And I know, like, just by nature of its mythical content, it's something that's difficult to even kind of describe, but it's something that you kind of mentioned throughout the book. This kind of archaic character. So I think,
Yeah.
like, kind of like spelling that out might be helpful.
Yeah, well, we talked about the ideology and the mythical attempt of communism to kind of deal with the technological age, but now I'd say it's time, other than liberalism, to address the third elephant in the room, that's fascism, right? So there's I would say there is a sense of loss of the archaic, loss of the traditional that comes with the rise of technology. That is lamented by many people, and I'd say especially the communists. But the communists, in a certain sense, see the only way out of it by overcoming it, by going through it, you could say. And that's essentially anchored in their ideology. But I would say the inherent inertia of reality can lead many initial Marxists or workers' movements to kind of rally around their most precious traditional goods that they are seeing being eroded. And that's kind of what explains a lot of the, you know, switching gears of a lot of Marxists and changing over to fascism, which essentially kind of tries, which finds a kind of mythical value that they see threatened and kind of builds a conceptual wall around it. And that is this kind of closing off, that is trying to avoid the dangers of this globalized technological network by sealing yourself off from it. And the thing is, in its original forms, those were genuine threats to liberalism. In its original forms, you know, liberalism would not, you know, engage in a world war if it hadn't been some form of danger. However, that danger, you could say, has historically been neutralized, yet there remains, for some reason, unlike with Marxism, there remains, for some reason, the constant fear of that returning. But returning in a sort of more total, more globalized form of some sort of like fascism lingering everywhere, right? There still seems to be this kind of fear, and it is projected especially on powers like China or Russia that are implementing kind of quasi-fascist policies to preserve, for example, their children from too much social media usage or whatnot. But in many ways, these are still very, you could say, soft measures compared to the historical movements of fascist doctrine, right?
I mean, would the Ukrainians disagree?
They may disagree. Yeah, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I would say that like the regimes of the past, I would say even as bad as things can be with the wars now, regimes of the past may have been even more ruthless in their pursuit of certain political actions.
So, what in this analysis of fascism and communism, particularly in like this lamentation of the loss of the traditional, perhaps, um, is contributing to a positive sense of a return to the archaic?
Yeah, I mean,
And just to like bring this fully around, right? Like one of the ways I think that you contextualize the archaic in the book is this notion of a unity between the subject and the object.
yeah, I mean that's the thing. It's like you can only understand these developments like fascism if you kind of can understand why they would be wanting to preserve certain things, and that is in many ways understandable. Like in many ways you get what they're trying to preserve. The question is just how contaminated is the approach of preserving it with what they're trying to protect it from, right? To what extent are you engaging in just a new kind of destruction, or end up engaging in an even more intensified destruction, leading to kind of the opposite taking effect that you were intending to do, and accelerating the destruction of the value you're intending to preserve. And I think, yeah, I think the key is here to carefully understand what was justified or what was understandably trying to be preserved, what was understandably trying to be discovered or rediscovered, but at the same time really understanding why it failed, often catastrophically so, right? And for that, I must disappoint you. I don't have a quick and easy idea or solution in mind.
Well, to bring this back to the quarantine, like if I'm if I'm putting on a technological deterministic history of the world hat, right? I would say like fascism is a response of technology's evisceration of the particular, right? And that response cannot be technological because the core compulsion is the evisceration of the particular, right? And it's not like a quarantine is viable outside of technology, right? Like technology is integrally, it's constitutive of defense, of politics, of the capacity to handle complexity, the capacity to coordinate, right? Um, to simply say that we are going to opt out of this game so that we can preserve these elements of community and tradition that we are putting more meaning to is essentially to make yourself vulnerable, right? To another community, another nation that does not believe those things and is happy to pursue technological power at the expense of any such limits or breaks, right?
But that's why fascism kind of aimed to kind of copy the approach of liberal modernity just in their own flavor, right? Like, and they did end up having a particular world order in mind as well. Um, because if they didn't, they would exactly what you were just saying would happen, right?
Right. Um, exactly. And so like this is where this notion of quarantine uh, again is both interesting, but also just seems so fundamentally antithetical to the kind of the game theoretic dynamics that technology kind of creates. And like you kind of have to wonder if there is some kind of like ultimate defense of technology, ultimate technology of kind of potential isolation,
Mm-hmm.
by which those kind of like larger game theoretic dynamics um, become less existential, right? Is there some endpoint of technology by which this notion of quarantine, this notion of particularity, can be pursued uh, as almost like there almost needs to be some kind of like immune response by which like any kind of like collective of people could say like, yeah, we are consciously making a decision to bias and preference these things over these things, and we understand that like by doing so we're not going to like put our entire community at existential risk due to just like classic game theory dynamics of defense or economics or any of these types of things.
Yeah.
And this is what I mean, right? Like so like the fascists like they didn't accept that a quarantine was possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that only a world order would be like the membrane by which their preferred worldview could exist is total, right? It has to be total. And like that's kind of the interesting dialectic with kind of that whole response relative to technology, at least as I see it.
Yeah, well, the thing is, what is interesting because of that anchor in something archaic, it was actually to some extent holding them back from actually pursuing a world order, which I would say made them ideologically weak, put them ideologically in a weaker position to something like liberalism or communism, um, because to a certain extent they weren't pursuing a an as abstract an ideal as the other systems would have done. I would say that to a certain extent they were looking at the reality. They were looking at the reality at the time in which the globe was dominated by a certain civilization, by a certain civilization with a certain race and certain or certain races and certain other cultures, civilizations, races were being subject to them and being exploited. That was the reality to a certain extent. And to a certain extent, the weakness in fascism was that they weren't actually planning to change very much about it. You know, they weren't actually moving towards a very kind of far off abstract goal. They were just kind of in many ways trying to just kind of freeze it where it is, or kind of formalize, have a formal science to it, or formal recognition of it. And I think that kind of reduced the pull of, or the global power of it, as it was more inward focused than others.
Right, and this also seems to support the notion that there was some inherent friction between uh, what constitutes like technology and its drives and its momentum and its capacity to autonomously grow without limit, and this notion of wanting to freeze things, right? Like liberalism kind of like inherently puts in place this kind of like triad of forces, this balance of powers, these checks and balances, these types of things. Like it has some notion of evolution kind of baked in. And so it's able to kind of more subtly respond to technology for both good and bad. And we're seeing plenty of the bad, right? But it's this co-constitutive force that is kind of baked into the symbiosis between technology and liberalism that reinforces both of these kind of like at their core fundamental principles of both. That I think what I'm kind of like ultimately driving at, right? Um, and yet, as we've kind of pointed to, what is the myth that is able then to kind of break through that, and kind of correct or supervene on some of these pathologies that we're seeing result from that?
Yeah, I mean, it somehow needs to be something that reconciles the dialectic of liberalism and fascism to an extent, because like the any kind of breaking out of that liberal structure has led to something akin to fascism, even if it was, you could say, socialist communist in name, right? And the American system, the Western liberal system, was capable of being flexible enough of accommodating it. So you could say that in many ways the regime of FDR had a lot of similarities with a kind of fascist state, with a fascist state economy, but the system was flexible enough of like, once it was no longer needed to preserve the system, it could move on to something else, which was not the case with Germany. Germany had to be fundamentally just rebuilt into a new country, basically. And yeah, so essentially the question is that flexibility at the same time not also a kind of even more anti-fragile, more kind of robust prison, right? Because it's kind of, you can try and change things, but it will all still be part of the matrix. It'll all still be within that system and will bounce back once the situation is changed, right?
This is exactly what we're talking about, right? Like to
Yeah.
me, and maybe now's a good time for you to kind of like define this notion of technics, right? But to me, that's precisely like the crux of the issue, in that there is nothing that we can point to that seems to have the universality, that seems to have the mythical power to offer anything of a corrective, to offer something bigger, by which pursuing that something bigger is going to be more important than this kind of inertia, this momentum, this compulsion that is kind of framing and entrapping everyone through this, this combination of liberalism and technology. And there's bigger questions here in terms of like what is required, and how much can be salvaged, and what is good and bad. And I think like all of these are super interesting questions that we could get into. But like fundamentally, we have this thing called technics that currently seems to have a will of its own that has exceeded our capacity to enforce any agency, to kind of direct it here and there. And so what are we left with?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a
So I
very,
mean, why don't we start with like how you define this, the idea of the machine and the idea of technics?
yeah. So the machine, Yeah, the machine is essentially mythical. I'm not talking about like a general category of all machines on Earth. I'm not talking about like a machine that we're all linked into, though that idea already does veer into the mythical. So it could be, you could see it as a bit closer to that. Um, but like essentially, as Heidegger already outlined, technics is a mode of the way being shows itself, like in the way we understand being and the way we understand what we engage with all day. That is essentially technological, and that is what defines our age, and that is what reinforces and expands the realm of that machine. And so far, this system has shown itself to be anti-fragile, meaning any kind of attempt to damage it strengthens it. And so that is the idea. So it's almost as if it actually lives off of that dialectic of damage and regrowth into something even more pervasive and even stronger. It's almost like, the reactionary fascism to break out of it is kind of almost a feature, not a bug. It's almost needed to expand its sphere. It's almost this kind of military armament, temporary military armament, is kind of part of what pushes its growth and advance. And that military armament is only made necessary through this kind of fascistic reaction to it. And so what is essentially needed is to find the core, the roots of both of these sides of this dialectic, and turn out of it. It's or what Heidegger would call verwinden. It's like a kind of overcoming by twisting out of an entanglement or something like that, right? It's kind of, we are entangled with it in all these ways, and it is something to recognize, acknowledge, and to a certain extent accept. But we also need to discover and what parts of it we need to reject and what parts we need to affirm. And this is like a fundamental, rediscovery of what makes us human, of the centrality, of the unity of metaphysics, of where metaphysics comes from, the unity where at which the morality, the truth, and the aesthetics, the true, the good, and the beautiful are not separate, but still united in one. And in a way, technology could be the vessel for it. In a way, paradoxically, technology could be what brings that forth, what actually points us to it, what makes us see it in a way that we wouldn't have been able to see before.
I completely agree. I mean, one of the things I often say is that technology is going to be the forcing function that makes us finally confront the death of God. Right? Like we've kind of like, okay, we killed God. That was the unifying worldview that kind of brought subject and object together, and created this sense of a cohesive kind of purpose and meaning that unified everyone, um, on all sides of the bell curve, right? Uh, and now there's been so many projects that have kind of attempted to fill that void, and they're essentially running on fumes, right? They've kind of exhausted themselves. They've fallen onto their own logical contradictions that are inherent in each of them, right? And we're now at the point and it seems like we're seeing a lot of convergence across a lot of different fields that are realizing this. And technology is what's pointing to this. Like a simple example is like this notion of ChatGPT writing students tests for them, and like this crisis of education.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, this is actually good. This is actually like showing us what writing actually is. Like writing is not just some mechanism to like achieve a score in school, or like to like be able to like read something and then synthesize it. Like writing is a tool for thinking. It's a tool for kind of taking what is incoherent and ambiguous in our minds, and putting it into a form by which it can be made legible to others, And this is a skill that kind of like transcends any essay.
Hmm.
And that skill itself is something that ChatGPT can never kind of reproduce, right?
Hmm.
And so like it's just a simple example of like, oh, now we like it's forcing us to understand really what writing is for. And when we're teaching writing, how we should be thinking about what writing can do, and kind of this kind of core exercise of thinking itself and what writing kind of reveals. And there's a million examples of that that you can go to. And I think like AI in particular is quite adept at revealing these if we look at it in the right way. And so like it's this combination of like getting to the limit of some of these technologies along with the exhaustion of
Hmm.
some of these other kind of like, and I think you point to these really well in the book in terms of science and, the contradictions inherent in science, liberalism that we've already talked about, the Enlightenment project of pure autonomy and pure control, which is essentially kind of being perfected in the digital universe. And we're seeing the pathologies that are emerging from that. All of these things kind of come together and forcing us to perhaps, at a point unique in history, to have a willingness to re-engage with the archaic, to re-engage with the mythical, to re-engage with the unity of the subject and object as something unique to the human experience that needs to be restored. And often the way that I say it is like this totality of the human imagination, to put technology back into conversation with religion and art and philosophy and culture, to kind of put life at the center of all of that is how I often say it. And ultimately to define what we could call a right relation
Hmm.
between nature, humanity, and technology. And
Yeah.
like I think technology is forcing us to kind of come to this point by which these uh, if answers don't seem obvious, at least the question now seems more obvious of demanding an answer. Whereas before, it would be it would be easy to point to just this kind of this notion of progress, right? And in the face of this progress, why should we object? Why should we impede on this at all? When we see so many people coming out of poverty, when we see us mastering disease, when we see the continuing economic lives of so many people being improved, these notions of quality of life and other economic metrics constantly going up. But I think, like particularly with the younger generation, like they're becoming disillusioned with that entire notion. They're seeing that there is an exhaustion there. It's as a ideology running on its own fumes,
Yeah.
and perhaps hopefully the hope, right? The saving hope, right? That's how Heidegger puts it. Is that this makes us open to kind of understanding these more foundational truths at our core, at the core of being.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, what a great point to wrap it up. And you were mentioning writing as well, and in that line of thinking, everyone should check out Tech for Life. Is that techforlife.com?
It is, yes.
Yeah, techforlife.com. That's Brandon's Substack, and everyone should check out Brandon's articles. And specifically, you published your manifesto, right?
I did. Kind of getting into this notion of life itself as being perhaps a mythological foundation of something that at least has the capacity to unite a global planetary or a global humanity, um, as something bigger than technology, something capable of being able to make value judgments on what technology ought to be for in a way that it would appear that nothing else is capable of doing.
Brilliant. Yeah. For anyone that wants to get deeper into Brandon's thoughts, check out the Substack, and I'm sure you're gonna enjoy people commenting and agreeing or disagreeing with what you have to say there.
Yeah, of course.
Right.
It's
Thanks for coming on my live stream, Brandon, and happy to have you on soon again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Once this book gets out here, once you start promoting it, get some other folks on to talk about it, be happy to participate.
Yeah, for sure. Take care.